Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, an animal attacks classic, Lair by James Herbert. Lair is a 1979 horror novel by the British author James Herbert, who really during the 70s and 80s was like the king of British horror, like the British equivalent of Stephen King. He was hugely successful, and a big part of his success came from the breakout success of his first novel, The Rat. So The Rat came out in 1974 and was pretty much immediately a really big hit. It really captured the public imagination, and it's interesting that it came out in the same year as the novel Jaws. So Jaws by Peter Benchley also came out in 1974, the movie of Jaws following in 1975. And these are two books that take a very different approach to the animal attacks genre, but basically, cemented it in the public consciousness really through the 1970s. So Jaws, clearly a single animal attacking. The Rat has multiple hundreds, if not thousands, of animals attacking. The other big difference between the two books is that Jaws, both in the book and the movie, has a really kind of, it's a classic summer book, isn't it? It has a summery feel to it. It's all about like the vacation time on Amity Island. And the stresses are on the local community because of that. So it's very much a summer book and very much an American book. It's got a very American vibe to it. The Rats, by contrast, is very British. It's very bleak indeed at times. The backdrop of the Second World War hangs heavy over the Rats. So the Rats is set in London, and you get scenes set in like bomb craters and things like that. So written in 74, so less than 30 years after the end of the Second World War, and the shadow of the destruction that the Second World War, wreaked on London in particular in the UK, really is noticeable in this book. So it's a much bleaker book and also a really angry book. I have done a separate review of The Rats. I did it a couple of years ago, so I'll link to that in the description of the video so you can check that out should you want to. But yeah, I think it's interesting that The Rats and Jaws came out in the same year, and as I say, kind of the two extremes of the animal attacks subgenre. So Lair then followed 5 years later in 1979, and it's a direct sequel to The Rats. Herbert did write another book in the series, so Domain came out 5 years later in 1984. And this one is actually kind of post-apocalyptic. So this one takes place after a nuclear war, with the rats kind of amassing and attacking again. I think I'm going to reread this. I haven't read this one for a long time either. There was a graphic novel which I think was called The City as well, which I think is a sequel to Domain, but I haven't ever read that. So let's talk about Lair then. So this is, I think, a really competent sequel. It gives the readers exactly what they want, but it builds really well on the success of the first book. It doesn't repeat the first book. It moves, the key difference really with Lair is that it moves the action to a different location. So as I said, The Rats takes place in London and really feels like a kind of urban horror story. Lair takes place in Epping Forest, so like a kind of wooded area out on the outskirts of London, in Essex. And it does a really good job of using that locale. So there are lots of scenes where like characters are kind of distanced from civilization, distanced from everyone else, and get attacked by rats in those locations. Like The Rats, it has a ton of like attack scenes in it. And it, as you would expect, this is no spoiler, it ends with humanity defeating the rats again. And like the rats, the humans that defeat humanity are a mix of like a central character, but there's a lot of kind of government involvement as well. And I think that's interesting that, again, in contrast to Jaws, both The Rats and Lair feature, the government getting involved, kind of ministers and things like that, and the army, whereas Jaws, if you think about it, is very much individuals going up against Jaws, whereas this has the state going up against the threat of the rat. So another interesting difference between the British and American approaches to horror. So as I said, the big difference between Lair and the rats is the location. So this has a more kind of rural, wooded location. But there's another really big difference, and that is in the skill that Herbert uses to actually tell the story. So I really, really like the rats. I think it's a great book, but it is a bit messy in terms of its plotting. It's not as neatly or as strongly kind of structured as it could have been. And the follow-up novel or the second novel that Herbert wrote, The Fog, suffers from the same problem. So The Fog, like the rats, is kind of a disaster movie kind of plot. So in the rats, it's rats attacking humanity. In the fog, it's this fog that kind of sweeps across the land and sends people like murderously insane when they inhale it. And like the rats, the fog is really messy in terms of its kind of plotting and structure. It's a bit ploddy at times. It doesn't really feel like it has tension running all the way through it. The two things Herbert does fantastically well in the rats and the fog and in Lair is build up incidental characters. So he gives you these characters who you pretty much know are not going to be on the page for very long. You pretty much know they're going to die horribly. But he uses a few pages to give you an insight into their lives, and not necessarily to make you care about them, but to make you interested in them. So he's very, very good at doing these quick character studies to give the characters that he then kills off, kind of a bit of flesh and blood, really, for the rats to sink their teeth into. So he does that very, very well. The other thing he does fantastically well is set pieces. So anyone who's read like The Rats or The Fog will probably remember some of the set piece scenes of horror. In The Rats, in particular, there's an attack on a school, which is really effective, and even more than that, an attack on a tube train, which is just phenomenally tense and brutal and just fantastically well done. Lair has a similar kind of fantastic set piece, so an attack on like a mobile home park, but it's not quite as good, I think, as the ones in the rats. But the thing that Lair does much better is the plotting. So it feels like Herbert matured over time. This is his fifth novel, I believe, and the plotting in this is much tighter, and it's a really interesting and well structured book. And the thing that's really notable about it is for the first third of the book, pretty much, there are no animal attack scenes. There are no deaths. Yeah, so he really builds things up slowly, but he does that in a great way, in that repeatedly through that initial third, where to an extent he's kind of building up characters and kind of telling you what's passed since the end of the rats. So at the end of the rats, the authorities think they've defeated the rats, and he explains what's happened that means that that's not the case. But what he also does in that first third is repeatedly have characters who he introduces who come in very close proximity to the rat, and you think, are they going to get it? Is there going to be a horrific attack? And then at the last minute he kind of pulls back, and he does that right near the start with a really young child, and that scene is very, very tense because of that. In the rats, there's a horrific scene where a baby gets attacked by the rats, and you kind of feel like, is he going to replay that with this toddler? And he doesn't. So you get this gradual build up of tension during that first third, which is really, really beautifully done. It reminded me a bit of the first third of the movie Aliens. So in Aliens, you've got that really, really slow build up. Lair does the same thing. And I think in both those cases, the creators, so James Cameron for Aliens and James Herbert for Lair, can do that because you as the reader or viewer know the terrible power of the monsters in the book. So you know how destructive the aliens in Aliens will be, and you know how destructive the rats in Lair will be because you've seen it before. So he can really tease things out. I'm reminded of a Hitchcock quote about suspense, where he talks about the difference between shock and suspense, and he talks about having a scene where there are two people like discussing something at a table in like, I think in his example they're like politicians who are at a summit or something like that, and there's a bomb underneath the table. And when that bomb is going to explode during the scene. Now, if you don't know that the bomb is there, you get a fantastic sense of shock when the bomb explodes. If you do know that the bomb is there, then you can really eke out the tension in the time until it explodes. And that's what Lair does. You know that the bomb is there, the bomb is the rats, and you know it's going to explode at some point. In the rats, he needs to show you right from the start the terrible power of the rats, and he shocks you again and again and again with that. But in Lair, instead, he just builds up that tension during the first third. The middle third of the book then is when the bomb explodes. The middle third of the book is just scene after scene after scene of people getting attacked by rats, and it's fantastic. It's really, really fun in a horrible way. It's really just very, very effectively done. He really does those set pieces well. As I say, he introduces characters and then brutally murders them. It's really, really fun in a very kind of paperbacks from hell horror style. This is a very pulpy book, but it's also a very well executed book. And then, as you'd expect, the final third of the book then is humanity's revenge on the rats, if you like. Humanity, clawing back control. Now, clearly, the book is followed by a domain, so that control is only in place for a short period of time. But the book does come to a satisfying conclusion. And he's got this kind of everyman hero in this book, like he had in the Rats. So in the Rats, the hero is a school teacher. In Lair, the hero is an exterminator, appropriately enough. So someone who works for a company called Ratkill, who are a company that have kind of, had success following the events of the Rats. So yeah, their services have clearly become a lot more in demand since the events of the Rats. And this hero, Luke Pender, works for that company. And the thing that's interesting about Pender is it only becomes clear that he is the hero of the book in the second half. In the first half of the book, it's much more around different people working together to try and defeat the Rats. And it only becomes apparent that Pender is like the central character as the book progresses. And that kind of collective action, I think is quite interesting, and it's well handled in this book. Harris, the school teacher, who's the hero from the first book, does get a bit of a mention as well. So the events of the end of the book are replayed, if you like, when one of the government officials talks to Pender about how the Rats were defeated first time around. So yeah, this feels like a very competent and well done sequel. I don't think I like it quite as much as the Rats. The Rats has kind of this anger to it, which I really, really enjoy. It feels like quite a punk novel, appropriately enough for a book that came out in the 70s. Lair feels more like a well-crafted novel. It's a bit, I suppose, to use the example of Alien and Aliens again, it's a bit like Aliens. Aliens is a supremely well-crafted film, but it doesn't necessarily have the energy or artistry of the first film. The first film feels like more of an interesting, more of a groundbreaking film, whereas Aliens feels like a really, really competent, well done, supremely enjoyable film, but a film that is using tried and tested techniques rather than trying to do something new. I think the same can be said of Lair. It's really, really fun and enjoyable, but it's not groundbreaking in the same way that the Rats was. So those are my thoughts on Lair by James Herbert. I definitely think it's worth reading. You can read it without having read The Rats first, but why would you do that? The Rats is fantastic as well. So if you haven't read them, read The Rats first and then read this. I think you'll have a great time, especially if you're a fan of animal attacks style books. Anyway, do let me know in the comments if you're a fan of James Herbert. Let me know if you like the Rats books. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.